Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. I apologise I couldn't be here in person. I'm presenting from the hospital, so if there's any thing coming through the loudspeaker, I may need to mute briefly. Like some other people who have been presenting over the last 2 days, I've only more recently come into the neurofibromatosis field and was really introduced to this by Professor Kate Drummond, who you've heard to recently. And I think very much wearing my oncology hat and some of the complications that can arise and how this background and understanding of precision medicine and targeted therapy can really be applied to this problem. And I think it's a really exciting time, I think, for the community. And I'm pleased to be here and talk about mech inhibitors more broadly than just Selumetinib. I think it's much more just important to think about the class of drug and how they might work and progress into the future. Here are my disclosures. So in terms of breaking down what I'd like to discuss today, very briefly, outlining the treatment for plexiform neurofibromas, thinking about the NF gene and pathway and how we can apply a targeted therapy or precision medicine approach in this situation. Some results from the published clinical trials of mech inhibitors and, detailing some of the side effects that we've come to know and understand over the past 10 years and current status in Australia, which I hope will set up for the discussion that will follow, that will be led by Louise. So plexiform neurofibromas, which are, you can see on this cartoon here on the right, they start in the peripheral nerves and occur in about 50% of people with neurofibromatosis type 1. And the cell that they start in is this little cell that's called a Schwann cell. And when there's an alteration in the NF1 gene, you get these cells that become a bit disorganized, they can grow and proliferate, and for many people don't cause any problems. However, for many people with NF1, and I'm sure there are people in the audience who understand this, can result in significant pain as well as other neurological consequences depending on where they are, and can also have a significant cosmetic and impact for patients as well. And very rarely, if these develop other mutations in them, can become cancerous in the future. So what about treatment for plexiform neurofibroma? And this is a very simple slide because historically this was surgery, 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 with really no other systemic therapy options that were very helpful for patients. However, with better understanding of the pathway, this has led to we call systemic therapy and targeted therapy to hopefully lead to better outcomes. And, over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a lot of promise. I apologise if there've already been discussions around the pathway here, but I think it's important to understand the pathway because that sort of makes sense about why we are using this particular group of drugs. What this cartoon shows here is at the top a representation of the NF gene. And when it's active and working in the normal way, it turns this protein RAS in green into the inactive form in red. And basically, in that particular cell, keeping things pretty quiet and resting, not doing too much and behaving like it should. However, when the NF1 gene is disrupted, that could be a mutation or loss of that gene, the other process happens, and this pathway on the left dominates, and we see an increasing proliferation and survival of the cells, which leads to the growth of plexiform neurofibromas, as well as other complications related to NF1. And if you see highlighted in the green box now, mech is one of the key members of this pathway. And so it's one of the points that we might be able to therefore develop drugs which can target that particular protein and therefore stop the cell proliferation and survival pathway. And mech inhibitors first emerge in cancer treatment, particularly in the treatment of melanoma, because it also has a disrupted pathway, this RAF-MEK that I've highlighted here, which leads to cell growth and proliferation. And that's important because, historically, even, you know, I'm a relatively young oncologist, but even 10 years ago when I first started, these drugs were not available, and metastatic melanoma was considered quite untreatable. However, given that we were better able to understand the biology of melanoma and the pathways that were disrupted, you know, can we then identify new treatments? And that's where these drugs emerged. And, you know, this is a sort of key story in the history of cancer treatment and precision medicine, where this little plot in the middle is what we call a waterfall plot and looks at people who are on a clinical trial. And you can see these downgoing bars showing, you know, more than 90% of people really benefited from treatment with this drug, mech inhibitor, in combination with another drug as well called a BRAF inhibitor. And on the right, you can see how in the PET scan of a patient, how it rapidly shrunk all of these tumours for the patient over a short period of time, and leading to significant improvement in their quality of life. Now, this isn't forever, and unfortunately, resistance has emerged to treatment, but it was really a starting point, and also got people wondering about where else these drugs might be helpful, because that pathway is disrupted in many types of cancers, as well as other non-cancers where they could have an important role in treatment. So mech inhibitors, as I said earlier, we're not just talking about selumetinib. There's at least 6 different drugs that have emerged from a variety of different pharmaceutical companies over the past 10 years that have been in clinical trials. However, most of the work in NF1 has been predominantly with selumetinib, and also the drug trametinib as well. And they've been tested really in 2 main scenarios. The first is for plexiform neurofibromas, as I outlined before. And this are some photos from a young person on a clinical trial who was treated with selumetinib, and on the left is the lump in the neck when they started treatment, and then 12 months later, significant shrinkage. And you can also see they've shown here person smiling and assuming they've also had significant benefit in their well-being as well on therapy. The other core challenge, clinical challenge, where these medications have been tried is for the complication of optic pathway glioma, or a low-grade brain tumour, which can occur. And again, similar to plexiform neurofibromas, you know, a lot of success has been seen with the use of this medication, but we're still really just at the beginning of understanding how best to use them. The third question that has been arisen and was a point of discussion in one of the sessions that we did yesterday was, can these medications improve cognitive function in patients with NF1 and who may have problems with both cognition, such as autism spectrum disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity, and behavioural changes. And there's a little bit of research where in this graph on the right, where young people around about 50 were treated with a mech inhibitor over a period of years. And what they showed was that, highlighted in the shaded top of the graph, was after 24 weeks and 48 weeks of treatment, there was some improvement in some measures of both cognition and also behaviour. And this is, again, an area of really important ongoing work to understand how this might happen and why this may be helpful for this particular problem. And really, again, the role of mech inhibitors in this particular scenario. Just switching tack a little bit now, because I want to bring up some of the clinical trials and providing the evidence for when and how to use the medication and any particular side effects. The first point I would like to say is, coming from an oncologist, is that I really believe that clinical trial medicine is good medicine. And there's a number of reasons why, but I think first and foremost is that it provides first-class care and an attention to detail. Being treated on a clinical trial means that you know that there are protocols followed, that patients and their families are seen more frequently, they're regularly reviewed, examined, tested and reassessed, and removes this kind of idea that near enough is good enough. And ultimately, this leads to better outcomes. There's significant benefit for patients and their families as well. Number one, because often it provides a key point of contact with additional support from a research team, as well as the supports that might exist outside of that research program. Often, and this is a key example when we're talking about MEK inhibitors, can provide early access to new treatments which are showing benefit, where waiting for approval and registration on the TGA and Medicare PBS may take much longer. Provides options and opportunity, and I think it provides a sense of hope, optimism, and often altruism as well, which is a key part of what we do. And finally, for science, clinical trials tell us what works and what doesn't work, and then helps the field move on to the next thing and the next combination and therapy that is going to lead to improvements in outcomes. So the clinical trial pipeline, and this may be familiar to some people, but the idea of a clinical trial pipeline is that research questions and benefits start in a laboratory setting, and that involves often testing in cells in laboratory and occasionally animal models as well, to see if the hypothesis that a treatment works can actually play out. They then go through a series of steps, what we call phase 1 trials, which is the first time you test a new drug in patients, through to phase 2, which is a larger number of patients, before a phase 3 trial is what we do before typically a drug becomes registered. And that's where you're comparing, say, a new drug compared to the old standard of care, which, if you're talking about plexiform neurofibromas, was nothing, because the previous standard of care was surgery. We didn't have any other medication. And so that's an important point when we talk about, say, the COMET trial that I'll discuss in a few minutes. When I was researching this talk today, I went back to see, look, just how long some of these medications have been in development. And this is an important story, and I think Louise might also give some perspective on this later, is the time it takes from development, when we first test a new medication in people, to it actually being registered, can be a really long time. So, the first trials of Selumetinib, or its precursor, were nearly 2 decades ago, testing in cancer. And if we look in this blue bar, one of the key trials testing this medication in young people with NF1 started in 2010, but continues ongoing and accumulating knowledge. It's not a short process. And then other pediatric trials shown below, which show benefit in plexiform neurofibromas. Our first adult trial, which again is more than 5 years old, and some phase 3 trials now. We're really trying to prove that this medication is better than what was available for young people with low-grade gliomas, is continuing, and you can see estimated completion date of 2027. So it takes a long time, and sometimes that's very hard, both as a clinician, as a consumer, and as a community, to accept when the science and the rationale looks so promising. And you can just see some of these arrows here, some of the points that were made in terms of key decision-making about approval and registration, and I've just left off where Australia sits on this, and we can discuss that a little bit later. This is, and there's a lot of text here in this table, but the reason I put this up is that there's a lot of ongoing clinical trials other than the 2 that are active in Australia at the moment for testing MEK inhibitors in patients with NF1 in a wide variety of scenarios. I think that's really important, because it's going to give us more information about when to use the medication, who to use them in, what are the potential side effects, and hopefully for how long to use them in. And that's going to be an ongoing question that we need to answer. So coming back to Selumetinib and some of the key milestone clinical trials. So the New England Journal of Medicine, or NEJM, is the peak journal for medical science. And this story was published in 2020, so-called the SPRINT trial. And this really defined the benefit of Selumetinib and MEK inhibitors in pediatric patients with NF1 who have symptomatic, most often pain, and inoperable plexiform neurofibromas. And what you can see is a really dramatic benefit. This is called a Kaplan-Meier curve, and what it's showing here is the time in which patients who were treated with selumetinib, their plexiform neurofibroma grew. And you can see in this graph at 3 years, more than 85%, so I think it was 85% of patients, it hadn't grown at all. And that's compared to the blue graph, the blue line compared to the natural history at the rate of growth, which is between 1 and 2 years. And hopefully this stays. We don't know how long it's going to be and how long the benefit will last, but hopefully, clearly it will be much longer. As well as a reduction or delay in this growth of the tumour, there was really significant improvements in quality of life outcomes. And that's an important part of any clinical trial testing a new medication. Clearly we want to see it help people, but, we want to see an improvement in quality of life, which can be measured through questionnaires, through interviews, and patient reports of their experience. And these bar graphs on the right, again, doesn't probably matter exactly the precise measure here, but in more than 2/3 of the patients, there was an improvement in either the patient-reported, an observer-reported outcome, or a measured outcome in quality of life. And this led to the key approval in the United States, the EU, and other markets for this younger age group. What about in adults? Which, being an adult oncologist, and, this is sort of where I sit and often considering the challenges. So whilst plexiform neurofibromas are typically present at birth, they continue to grow and manifest throughout adolescence into early adulthood, and they continue to cause clinical symptoms. And, given that spontaneous shrinkage and resolution of symptoms is pretty unlikely, clearly we need therapies that are helpful for adult patients as well. Because adults have a significant unmet need, and, it's been discussed over the last 2 days, but, some of the really amazing work that I've heard about from health professionals, from researchers from around Australia, and, really hoping we can bring some of that science and health research to a clinic in Melbourne. So there is some evidence for the use of mech inhibitors for adults. This is a small trial which tested the drug selumetinib in 27 adults with NF1 who had inoperable and symptomatic plexiform neurofibromas. Most people who went on this trial were experiencing pain. You can see here more than 2/3 benefited. So a partial response means a shrinkage of more than 20% of the neurofibroma. But it also takes time to see a response, almost a year before the time to see shrinkage of the tumour. So, there is a case that you do need to stick with it to really see the maximal benefit. And in fact, in some of the other studies, even though it took 12 months to see benefit in people who were on treatment at 2 years, it was still getting better for some people. So, it's potentially a long course of treatment to get the maximum benefit. And as a summary of some of the key clinical trials in both children and adults, you can see that similarly, they both benefit. In the lighter green trials using a number of different mech inhibitors in children with neurofibromatosis type 1 and plexiform neurofibromas. And you can see the response rate in terms of how they shrunk is above 70% for most of these trials. And in the darker bars, you can see the benefit in adults, even in the 2 trials on the far right, still more than 40%. Now, clearly we'd like it more than that, but certainly coming from a cancer field, that's a really impressive starting point to progress the field. So what are the current clinical trials in Australia? There's 2 core clinical trials. One of them is called TINT and one of them is called COMET. So the TINT trial is predominantly a study for young people, so pediatrics and adolescent young adult. That's an age group up to the age of 25 with NF1 associated both plexiform neurofibromas and optic pathway gliomas. And ANZCHOG is the Australian and New Zealand Children's Haematology and Oncology group, which run the vast majority of clinical trials in young people. So this is, as I said, for younger people, 3 months to 25 years. And there's two core groups here. Number one, plexiform neurofibroma, and number two, the optic pathway gliomas. So really trying to understand the benefit of this MEK inhibitor, trametinib, in those two groups. But it also answers or addresses a key problem, and that is addressing access to MEK inhibitors in Australia. The reason why there's an untreated control group will help answer some of the questions about, do MEK inhibitors impact cognition and behaviour change? And so we're able to compare the treated group to the untreated group to see if some of those early results stood true, and is there really a rationale for MEK inhibitors in that particular scenario. So the COMET trial, which Renee introduced, is sponsored by AstraZeneca, Alexion AstraZeneca, and is for adults with inoperable plexiform neurofibromas who are symptomatic, and that might be pain or other neurological consequences. It could also be cosmetic due to disfigurement from the lesion as well. Patients complete a pain diary prior to being randomised, and this is a bit different. So not everyone gets the active drug up front. So half of the patients will be randomised to receive selumetinib, half to receive a placebo, and you won't know. Both the patient doesn't know, the company doesn't know, and the clinician doesn't know either. But after 12 months, everyone gets access to the medication. And that's important because we need to compare a medication to what's considered standard of care, which I said before was, well, nothing, to actually prove that it's better. Does it actually improve pain? And does it actually lead to shrinkage? So that's an important question. This is an international study, and we're fortunate to have two sites open in Australia, one here at the Peter Mac, and one in Sydney at Royal North Shore with Associate Professor Berman. I wanted to think a little bit about treatment and toxicity, and I think there's always important to weigh up this question of toxicity and response. When we're looking at all of this great outcome data, well, what is the risk? And when we're talking about risk, we're talking about risk to quality of life. And so balancing the benefit of response versus toxicity. And I think there's always this sort of scenario that we need to consider. Someone who needs treatment, will they benefit from treatment based on the clinical trials? And ultimately, will they also tolerate treatment? And trying to find that Venn diagram to make sure that we're only prescribing medications when we know it's going to benefit and people will tolerate the treatment and not cause harm. There's a number of side effects, and we really understand these a lot better over the past 10 years because of significant experience in the cancer field. The most common side effect, and you may know of people who have experienced this, is rash, and probably occurs in up to 50%, and it's a little bit variable between the type of medication. The classic rash is a bit like acne, but can be a variety of different types of rashes, and can also cause some swelling and irritation around the nail beds as well. Other side effects which are common include diarrhea, nausea, and fatigue. But whilst these are common, most people, they're quite manageable and tolerable. But in some people, they are bad enough to cause people to want to stop the medication. It's also important there are rare but potentially serious outcomes. And for some people, that is a reduced cardiac function, which mostly isn't symptomatic, so it doesn't cause pain or shortness of breath, but maybe measured a reduction on people having an echocardiogram or ultrasound of their heart. And the other another potentially serious side effect is changes to vision due to an impact on the retina. But because we've developed more experience, most of the side effects are really well managed by experienced clinicians, working as part of multidisciplinary teams, particularly involving our dermatology colleagues to manage rash, eye specialists to monitor for vision, and cardiologists and others involved in monitoring the heart. So, knowing what to look for and understanding how the medication works is important. So finishing off now with sort of the current status, and this table's a little bit North American focused, but it gives you a bit of an essence of a summary of the fact that we've got multiple different MEK inhibitors. Most of the approved indications are for melanoma, although, as I mentioned earlier, selumetinib is improved for plexiform neurofibromas. Gives you a sense of, are there any NF1 focused trials for those drugs, some of them which have been published and a number of them which are ongoing. But, not other than Selumetinib being approved in the US and EU, we need to, change that situation for access to these medications for patients in Australia. And while Selumetinib was approved by the Therapeutic Goods Administration, it's not yet funded by Medicare, and Louise can really go through the nuance of this later on and what that means for next steps as a community. So in summary, I've sort of hopefully gone through how dysfunction of the NF1 gene can lead to cell growth and proliferation and ultimately plexiform neurofibromas. But this is associated with an activation of a number of pathways which can be targeted. And there's really growing evidence on the use of mech inhibitors in plexiform neurofibromas, but also in low-grade glioma, and this question about its role in cognition and behavioural change. However, they're not without toxicity. So I think all of these clinical trials that are ongoing will really help define when to use and who is most likely to benefit. And again, thanks very much for the opportunity to be here today, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Jim. That was great. Do we have any questions in the room for Jim around Selumetinib or any of the mech inhibitors? There's a hand go up over there. Just waiting for some. Anyone online would like to submit a question as well, please feel free. Surely there's one. No? Lost opportunity? Okay, no problem. Thank you, Jim. No questions.
See you later.